Hello everyone. Tonight we begin with the not-so-glorious truth of warrior life where bravery looked less like noble heroism and more like sneaking into camps at night, stealing horses, and hoping you didn't get your scalp peeled off as a receipt. From captives beaten into adopted family, to warriors carrying the whispers of every ghost whose hair they took, to entire societies built on revenge that never really ended. This isn't the romantic warrior tale you were taught. It's blood, honor, and nightmares woven together. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you actually enjoy wandering into the darker corners of history with me. No pressure, but it keeps me from talking to myself at 2 a.m. about scalps. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? I like to imagine these stories echoing across different rooms and time zones, like a strange midnight fire we're all sitting around together. So, go ahead, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself some tea, or just let the hum of a fan be your background chant. And let's slip into tonight's story, the shadowed world of Native American warrior life. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Forget your modern baby showers with cupcakes and pastel balloons. If you'd been born into a warrior culture on the North American plains or forests, your welcome party would have been a lot less cute photo album and a lot more initiation into pain, survival, and destiny. Your first lullaby might have been the steady rattle of a gourd drum or the hushed chanting of an elder, not because they wanted you to sleep peacefully, but because every breath you took was already wrapped in the expectation that one day you'd hold a bow, a spear, or a musket and prove you weren't useless. Childhood wasn't a soft landing. It was boot camp dressed up as daily life. From your first wobbly steps, you were measured for endurance. That little tumble in the dirt. Nobody rushed to sanitize you with wet wipes. Instead, someone probably nodded approvingly, because hay scrapes are free lessons. Toys weren't plush bears. They were mini bows and arrows, bone knives carved blunt, or small hoops for target practice. You weren't playing, you were rehearsing. The idea of a carefree childhood was as foreign as a Disney Channel marathon. And oh, let's talk about pain. Pain wasn't an enemy, it was a teacher. Boys were expected to toughen up early, sometimes through playful seeming, but calculated tests. You might be accidentally pushed into cold water to see if you'd cry, or encouraged to run long distances barefoot over thorny ground to harden your feet and lungs. Did you whimper? Bad sign. Did you keep running until you coughed blood? Congratulations, you had potential. But training wasn't just about muscles. It was about memory. Elders told stories sometimes around smoky fires, sometimes during ceremonies that weren't bedtime fairy tales. They were blood-soaked reminders of who fought bravely, who took a scalp, who held their head high while tortured, and who disgraced their family by whimpering when the enemy tied them to a post. You absorbed these tales like kids today memorize superhero trivia. Only difference, your heroes weren't flying-caped crusaders. They were cousins and uncles who raided a rival camp, brought back horses, and returned without their ears frozen off. Oh, and the animals, let's not forget them. If you grew up among the plains tribes after horses had been introduced, you'd be expected to treat that animal less like a pet and more like an extension of your body. By age 6, some boys were already riding bareback, clinging on with thighs of steel, while you might still be struggling to ride a bike with training wheels. Before contact with horses, the same discipline came through hunting, stalking deer, snaring rabbits, tracking prints in the mud. Either way, you were raised to be sharp, silent, and efficient, or at least better than the boy from the neighboring lodge. And looming above all this, the spiritual side. It wasn't enough to be quick with a bow, you also needed supernatural backup. The seeds of that were planted early. Sweat lodges, fasting rituals, or even just being told that dreams weren't random, they were messages. That nightmare where you were chased by wolves. Someone would whisper that maybe, just maybe, the wolf was calling you as a guardian. Sleep tight, little warrior. So yes, while modern babies get stuffed animals, you would have been stuffed with obligation. Every gesture, every stumble, every cry was noted as a forecast of what kind of fighter you'd become. And if that sounds suffocating, don't worry, you didn't get to complain, because the real tests hadn't even started yet. Childhood was just the prologue, the gentle rehearsal before someone handed you a weapon and expected you to touch your first enemy before breakfast. So, you've survived the bruises of childhood without crying too much, which means congratulations, you've now graduated to actual training. And this isn't the modern version where training means soccer practice, followed by juice boxes. No, this was the era where your training kit was equal parts sweat, starvation, and sheer willpower. If you thought childhood games were rough, here's where they casually start shaping you into something between an athlete and a spiritual hostage. Let's start with the physical side. Archery wasn't just a hobby, it was the extension of your body. You'd be drilled until your fingers developed permanent calluses from pulling sinew strings. Tracking wasn't a fun scavenger hunt, it meant being able to follow a set of faint hoofprints across frozen ground for days without losing your way. Your elders would test you by sending you into the woods or plains with minimal supplies, watching from afar to see if you froze, starved, or actually figured out how to live. If you returned having trapped something edible, you were praised. If you returned empty-handed, they smiled thinly. The way a coach looks at the weakest player on the team. Better luck next time, kid. And then came the horses. If you were born in the centuries after Spanish horses transformed the continent, you were expected to master riding as if you'd been born in the saddle. Warriors didn't use stirrups, mind you. You learned to ride bareback, gripping with your thighs, guiding with knee pressure, leaning low to the horse's flank to avoid arrows. Some boys could scoop a dropped weapon off the ground while galloping at full speed. Meanwhile, you're still struggling to parallel park. But here's the kicker. Training wasn't only about sinew and sweat. You also had to cultivate a connection with forces you couldn't see. Vision quests. For example, picture yourself at 12 or 13, alone on a hill or deep in a forest, fasting for days, no food, no water, praying that some spirit bear, eagle, thunder, or shadow would appear in dream or waking vision. And when it did, that spirit wasn't just a cool hallucination. It was supposed to become your lifelong ally. From then on, every raid, every fight, every gamble with death would be done under its gaze. Failed to find a spirit protector, and well, you weren't exactly set up for a long career. The sweat lodge, too, was less about relaxation and more about purging weakness. You sat in a pitch-black hut, heated by glowing stones, steam suffocating, your lungs begging for mercy, while songs and prayers thundered around you. You emerged drenched, trembling, supposedly cleansed and ready for battle. Think of it as a combination of sauna, exorcism, and panic attack, and superstition. It shadowed every step. You couldn't just pick up a bow. It had to be blessed or decorated with symbols. Before a hunt or raid, warriors might paint their bodies, not for style points, but to confuse enemies or trick hostile spirits. The belief wasn't that battles were purely flesh against flesh, it was spirits colliding through human bodies. If your opponent had stronger allies in the unseen world, your muscles weren't going to save you. So here you were, half athlete, half mystic, constantly being honed for both the physical and spiritual battlefield. You couldn't slack, because failure meant not just personal embarrassment, it meant your entire community wondering why the spirits had refused to back you. And if you think that pressure was bad, just wait, because the real test wasn't whether you could survive fasting or shoot an arrow. Straight, it was whether you could survive your first actual raid. So here you are, barely tall enough to look intimidating, and suddenly someone decides you're ready for your first raid. Think of it as the ancient version of a job interview. Except, instead of sitting in front of a panel and awkwardly talking about your strengths and weaknesses, you're sneaking into enemy territory at night, hoping not to get your scalp rearranged. Welcome to adulthood. This wasn't optional. If you wanted to be counted as a man, if you wanted songs sung in your honor, or even if you just wanted to avoid being treated like a permanent errand boy, you had to prove yourself in war. And here's the interesting twist. It wasn't always about killing. In many tribes across the plains, the highest form of courage was counting coup-touching an enemy in battle with a hand, bow, or coup stick, and then escaping unharmed. That's right, the bravest thing wasn't to stab someone, but to humiliate them by tapping them and running off. Imagine risking your life to basically play the deadliest game of tag ever invented. But don't misunderstand, killing happened, and when it did, it was heavy with meaning. Warriors didn't just swing weapons blindly. Every strike, every action was weighed in terms of honor, spirits, and the impact on your reputation back home. If you killed, you might be expected to take a trophy, a lock of hair, or, yes, a scalp to prove it. If you didn't, then you at least had to return with a story that sounded impressive enough for the elders to nod solemnly and not quietly wonder if you'd hidden behind a rock the whole time. And here's the psychological trick. Everyone was watching. Not during the raid itself, of course, but afterward. The warriors you accompanied, the elders waiting back in camp, even the women who sang victory songs, all of them would scrutinize you. Did you hold steady under pressure? Did you hesitate? Did you show fear when arrows hissed past your head? Your first trial wasn't just survival. It was your public audition for a lifelong role. Oh, and failure wasn't just embarrassing. It could brand you for years. A young man who panicked or ran could be mocked, excluded from raids, or denied the chance to marry. Well, honor was currency, and without it you were broke. Success, on the other hand, could launch you into warrior societies, give you status, and earn you the right to paint your face, dance in ceremonies, and boast about your exploits. Of course, boasting had rules. You couldn't exaggerate too wildly, because elders remembered everything and would happily call you out for inventing details. But if you had a scalp, a coup stick, or even a decent scar, you had evidence. Nothing builds credibility faster than rolling up your sleeve and casually showing the knife wound you picked up while reminding a Pawnee not to sleep too comfortably. So yes, your first trial was less about battle glory and more about surviving a night of terror while trying to look impressive doing it. You weren't just fighting enemies, you were fighting the possibility of going home nameless. And once you'd tasted that, once you'd felt the raw panic of your heart pounding in the dark, you realized something. This wasn't a one-time event. This was your life from now on. And the raids, oh, they were just getting started. Because after your first taste of combat, you'd learn why these lightning strikes weren't just about proving bravery, they were about wealth, honor, and survival itself. So you've made it back alive from your first trial, your scalp still firmly attached, and suddenly you're not just the kid who carried water anymore. You're a warrior in training with a taste of the adrenaline that's going to run your life from here on out. Because raids weren't side gigs. They were the economy, the politics, and the Instagram feed of the time everything worth bragging about or fearing was tied up in them. Let's start with the obvious stuff. Raids got you things you couldn't always get at home. Horses were the #1 prize after they galloped north from the Spanish colonies. Owning more horses meant more prestige, more trading power, and more leverage in arranging marriages. Horses could literally transform your social rank. Without them, you were just another face in the camp. With them, you were a somebody. And if you thought raiding for horses was a small errand, remember stealing them often meant sneaking into an enemy camp at night, untying animals while people slept feet away, and getting out without making a sound. Miss one knot, and suddenly you're sprinting with arrows flying at your back. But raids weren't just about loot, they were about honor. And honor was a currency far more volatile than gold. Each successful raid padded your reputation, raised your standing in warrior societies, and secured you a seat at council fires. A man who never raided was a man without status he could provide. Sure, but he didn't glow with that aura of risk and triumph. Meanwhile, a man who led raids successfully could carve his name into songs. Your deeds weren't written down in stone tablets. They were remembered in voices, retold at firesides, sung during dances. And of course, raids were deeply tangled in cycles of revenge. One tribe raided another, took horses, sometimes captives. The other side retaliated weeks, months, or years later. Violence wasn't random, it was rhythmic, almost ritualistic. You weren't just out there being violent, you were settling scores, proving bravery, and maintaining the endless balance of rivalry. That feud might have started before you were born and would likely outlive you, and yet every raid you joined stitched you deeper into the fabric of that blood ledger. It also mattered how you acted during a raid. Bravery wasn't just about survival, it was about style. Did you charge forward recklessly? Did you shield your companions? Did you retreat too quickly? Every move was catalogued by someone's eyes, and later by someone's tongue. You weren't just raiding for horses. You were raiding for narrative control of your life story. And heaven forbid you returned empty-handed. Worse than being injured was coming back with nothing to show. No scars, no trophies, no horses. Better to limp home half-dead with one rein clutched in your fist than to walk in whole and empty. And if you think raids were quick one-offs, think again. For many, they were seasonal rhythms, organized around food, resources, and opportunity. A successful raid could sustain your people through lean times. A failed raid might leave you hungry, dishonored, or even spiritually tainted. Because yes, every life taken, every horse stolen, Every scalp lifted carried consequences beyond the physical. That shadow is waiting for you in the next stage, where trophies weren't just souvenirs. They were living reminders that the dead don't always stay quiet. So, picture this. You've just survived a raid, adrenaline pumping, your lungs burning, and suddenly someone decides the real proof of bravery isn't just making it out alive. It's what you bring back. Horses, sure. Stories, absolutely. But nothing screamed victory quite like walking into camp with someone else's scalp swinging from your belt. Yes, scalping. The practice so notorious that Europeans couldn't stop writing about it and, ironically, started paying for it once they realized how effective it was at weaponizing violence. Now, here's the twist that might crack your modern assumptions. Scalping wasn't originally an invention of native peoples. Archaeological evidence shows it existed long before Europeans set foot on the continent, but contact with colonists supercharged it. French, British, and later American officials literally offered bounties cash rewards for enemy scalps. And suddenly what had been a ritual marker of victory became a transcontinental business. If you thought capitalism couldn't get darker, imagine a government payroll tied to bags of human hair. But strip away the colonial inflation, and scalping in its older sense carried deep symbolic meaning. To take a scalp wasn't just to prove you killed someone, it was to seize a fragment of their power. Hair itself was sacred in many traditions, tied to strength and identity. Removing it was a way of humiliating the enemy, stripping them of their spirit, and carrying a visible reminder of dominance. A scalp was both proof and curse, a trophy that hummed with the unsettling idea that its original owner wasn't entirely done with you. And of course, scalps became public theater. They were displayed, waved in dances, or fastened to poles for ceremonies. Sometimes they were gifted to women of the village, who would then sing victory songs while parading the bloody symbol of conquest. A scalp wasn't tucked away in a box like some grim keepsake, it was flaunted. Everyone needed to see it, because reputation depended on it. But here's where the irony cuts deep. The prestige came with baggage. Scalping was dangerous not only because you had to get close enough to an enemy to do it, but also because of what followed. Many believed the spirit of the slain lingered in the scalp, restless and vengeful. That little patch of skin could whisper nightmares, bring bad luck, or follow you like a curse unless proper rituals were done. Warriors purified themselves in sweat lodges, smoked ceremonial pipes, or sought cleansing from medicine men just to quiet the voices of the dead. So you lived with this paradox. The same act that made your name glorious could also rot your spirit from the inside. The scalp was honor and haunting rolled into one, and you couldn't exactly throw it away. Too much prestige had been invested in it. You displayed it proudly, even as you wondered if its owner was watching from the other side, waiting for the day your luck ran out. And if you thought scalping was the worst of it, think again, because not every enemy was killed outright. Some were dragged back alive and their fate was about to make scalping look merciful. So, you thought raids ended neatly with trophies and songs. Not quite. Sometimes you didn't just come home with horses or scalps, you came home with people, captives, to be precise. And what happened to them reveals one of the strangest contradictions of warrior life. Brutality on one hand, adoption on the other. If you'd been taken in a raid, your fate depended on a roulette wheel of tribal custom, timing, and mood. Some captives were executed, quickly ritual killings designed to avenge lost kin or to restore cosmic balance. Others, though, were dragged back alive to be tested, punished, or folded into the tribe in ways that blurred the line between cruelty and kinship. Here's the cold part. Captives weren't always treated as human at first. A man might be forced to run a gauntlet through the village, beaten with sticks, stones, and fists, the entire community taking part. Survive that, and you had a chance at a second life. Fail, and well, your scalp joined the growing collection. Women and children fared differently. They were often spared outright killing because they could be absorbed. Children adopted to replace lost ones. Women married into families, their old identities erased as new roles were carved for them. Adoption wasn't just symbolic, it was transformative. A child brought into a family would be renamed, dressed in tribal clothing, and expected to forget their old language. Some, remarkably, thrived and fully embraced their new lives, never looking back. Colonial records are full of desperate parents trying to ransom children, only to find those children refusing to return because the world they'd been adopted into, for all its violence, had given them belonging. But don't romanticize it too much. For adults, the process could be brutal. Warriors might ritualize the death of your old self. Beatings, humiliations, even mutilations meant to sever your ties to your former identity. Adoption wasn't a warm hug, it was a hard reset, enforced through pain and ritual. You weren't just joining a new family, you were being reborn under duress. And here's where it gets twisted. The line between adoption and enslavement blurred. Some captives, particularly women, ended up in exploitative roles, servants, laborers, or worse. Others became symbols in diplomatic negotiations, traded or ransomed for goods. Your body, your very existence, became currency. To warriors, though this wasn't random cruelty, it was about repairing cosmic and social balance. If you lost a son in battle, you took an enemy child to replace him. If you lost a husband, you brought home a captive to fill the void. The violence wasn't just personal, it was woven into a system of grief, revenge, and continuity. But whether you were being celebrated at a fire as a newly adopted brother or being forced into servitude, one truth remained. Raids always left more than corpses behind. They reshaped families, altered bloodlines, and turned strangers into Kainor ghosts. And if you thought captivity was brutal, wait until you hear what happened to those unlucky enough to be kept alive, not for adoption, but for ritual torture. Because sometimes, the real spectacle began only after the raid ended. So, let's say you weren't scalped on the battlefield, and you weren't lucky enough to be adopted into a new family. That left you in the third category, the living sacrifice. And here's where things get grim. Because torture wasn't random, sadism, it was a performance, a ritual, a way of rebalancing the universe. To die at the hands of your enemies wasn't simply an execution, it was cosmic theater. Captured men were sometimes tied to stakes in the center of camp. Fires crackled nearby, children gathered to watch, women sang, warriors circled, and everyone prepared for the show. You, bound and bleeding, were no longer just a person, you were the vessel through which revenge and justice flowed. Every cut, every burn, every strike was a response to past losses. You represented the enemies who had killed brothers, fathers, sons. Your suffering was their repayment. But here's the eerie twist. The cruelty wasn't meant to degrade you, it was meant to measure you. A true warrior was expected to endure pain without flinching, to taunt his captors, to laugh at death itself, cry out in agony, and you dishonored your people. Endure with a steady gaze, and you were respected, sometimes even admired by those killing you. Imagine that your reputation depended on how stylishly you could face being burned alive. And yes, fire was common. Captives might have burning brands pressed against their skin, or their flesh cut open and sprinkled with hot coals. Fingers, ears, or toes could be severed one by one. Songs accompanied the spectacle, because this wasn't quiet brutality, it was ritualized, choreographed, saturated with symbolism. To modern eyes it looks monstrous. To theirs, it was balancing a scale that had tipped with blood. The expectation wasn't only on the victim. The tormentors, too, had to perform properly. Women might slash or burn the captive in honor of lost relatives. Warriors tested their own courage by approaching, striking, then stepping back. The whole community was implicated. Your death was shared, consumed, ritualized, and yet, out of this nightmare emerged a strange reciprocity. If you faced death bravely, you might earn the respect of your captors. Some accounts tell of warriors adopting the songs or gestures of those they tortured, honoring them in twisted admiration. A man who mocked his tormentors with steady defiance could live on in their stories as much as their own heroes. In other words, even in dying, you were still playing the game of honor. It's here that the philosophy of balance comes into sharp relief. Torture wasn't about cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was a ledger being evened. You killed one of mine, now I'll test your endurance. If you prove brave, you restore dignity to both sides. If you fail, your shame lingers long after your ashes scatter. So yes, the spectacle was horrifying, but it wasn't mindless. It was cosmic bookkeeping written in scars and screams. And once you'd seen that, once you'd heard the fire crackle around a bound enemy singing his last song, you realized something. Battles weren't just fought with arrows and lances. They were fought in the invisible world, too, with spirits and omens whispering that this cycle of blood was far from over. Because the battlefield didn't end when the body fell. It extended into visions, rituals, and the haunting certainty that the dead weren't quite done with you. By now you've realized that a raid wasn't just a military errand, it was a gamble in a cosmic casino, and the house always had the upper hand. Before you picked up a bow or whispered a war song, you needed to know, were the spirits on your side today, or were they sharpening their claws to watch you fail? Everything hinged on signs. A warrior wouldn't just wake up, tie his moccasins, and say, "Let's go raid the neighbors." No, he'd consult omens, the flight of birds, the cry of an owl, the shape of clouds, even how the wind moved through the grass could cancel or greenlight an entire raid. Imagine being halfway across the prairie and suddenly someone notices a crow flying in the wrong direction. Game over. Everyone turns round. Call it inconvenient. They called it survival. And when omens weren't enough, you turned to spiritual insurance. Medicine bundles, carefully crafted collections of sacred objects, were believed to house protective power. A claw, a feather, a stone, a bit of paint. Each item linked you to spiritual allies. You didn't just wear war paint for intimidation, it was a coded signal to the unseen world. Cover me, I'm going in. Dreams, too, weren't private nonsense. They were directives. A warrior might fast for days, praying for a vision that would reveal his guardian spirit. Maybe it was a bear, promising strength. Maybe an eagle, offering sharp sight and courage. Maybe thunder itself, promising terrifying power and equally terrifying consequences if ignored. Once revealed, that spirit became your lifelong partner, and going into battle without honoring it was like walking into a gunfight unarmed. And you weren't the only one listening. Enemies had their spirits too. Battles weren't just skirmishes of flesh and arrows, they were clashes of unseen allies hovering above, watching, influencing, deciding. Lose a raid, and people wouldn't just say you fought badly, they'd say your spirits abandoned you. Victory, therefore, was both physical and metaphysical, a sign that your guardians were stronger, your prayers louder, your sacrifices accepted. But here's the creepy underside. Those spirits didn't always leave after the fight. Kill someone, and their soul might cling to you, stalking, whispering, waiting for a weak moment to drag you into sickness or misfortune. Even a scalp taken in triumph could become a spiritual parasite unless you purified yourself in sweat lodges, smoke, or ritual fasting. Without cleansing, you risked nightmares, illnesses, even madness. Every trophy was double-edged, prestige in the village, but a curse in the night. So picture yourself returning from a raid, your bundle intact, your spirit honored, maybe even a scalp swinging from your belt. Everyone cheers, women sing, the children point, but deep down, you can't shake the feeling that someone else came home with you, not a fellow warrior, not a prisoner, a shadow, an echo of the one whose hair you now carry, waiting to test if your rituals were thorough enough. And that's the paradox you lived with. Every raid was as much about appeasing the spirits as defeating enemies. You were never just fighting people. You were fighting the invisible contracts that bound life and death together. And no matter how many songs were sung in your honor, you knew the real question was this: could you outrun the restless dead? Because if you couldn't, you'd be trapped in the next stage of warrior life, living with honor on your belt and ghosts at your heels. So you've done it. You rode into camp with a scalp tied to your belt, your face painted, your name echoing in song. Everyone cheers, and you feel 10 feet tall until night comes. That's when the real weight sets in, heavier than any coup, stick, or horse rein. Because a scalp isn't just a trophy, it's company, and not the comforting kind. You see, hair was sacred. It wasn't just decoration. It was an extension of life force, a spiritual antenna. By cutting it, you didn't just take proof of victory, you took a slice of someone's essence, and that essence doesn't always leave politely. Restless spirits were believed to cling to their stolen hair, hunting the warrior who carried it. That lock of skin and hair tied to your belt might as well hum at night, pulling shadows toward your bed. Sleep, when it came, was thick with nightmares, and those weren't dismissed as just dreams. They were signs. A wrong dream could mean sickness, misfortune, or worse, the spirit had found a way back in. That's why purification rituals weren't optional. After raids, warriors entered sweat lodge, small, suffocating domes filled with burning stones doused in water until the steam scalded the lungs. You crouched in the dark, songs pounding around you, praying the spirit would be appeased, or at least tricked into leaving you alone. Without it, people believed your victories would curdle into madness or death. Even then, the burden didn't lift easily. Carrying scalps meant carrying responsibility. If misfortune struck, if someone fell ill, if the hunt went badly, if the weather turned sour, people might whisper that your trophy was to blame. You'd become a walking suspect in the cosmic court of balance. Yes, the scalp made you honored, but it also made you radioactive. And yet, you couldn't just discard it. That would be dishonor. Once you had it, you displayed it in dances, offered it to women to carry during ceremonies, tied it to poles during feasts. The scalp became part of the village, woven into rituals that celebrated victory and reminded everyone of vengeance. Your prestige depended on it, even as your spirit sagged under its invisible weight. And here's the bleak irony. The more scalps you took, the greater your fame and the greater the army of spirits that followed you. Warriors with many trophies weren't just admired. They were haunted men, constantly battling unseen enemies as fierce as any they'd faced on the plains. They lived at the intersection of glory and paranoia, loved by their people, stalked by their victims. So when you walked through camp, people might bow their heads with respect, but in the silence of night, lying awake under the skin tent, you felt them. Those restless voices breathing against your ear, reminding you that war was never really over. You'd won in daylight, yes, but at night, you were never entirely sure whose company you were keeping. And if that sounds suffocating, because you weren't just a lone warrior, you were also bound into something larger, a web of rules and obligations that pressed on you every day. Warrior societies didn't let you sit with your ghosts in peace. They turned those burdens into structure, oath, and relentless discipline. So, you're carrying scalps, haunted at night, praised by day, and you think maybe now you can breathe. Not a chance. Because in many tribes, your status as a warrior wasn't just personal. It was woven into organizations called warrior societies. Think of them as elite clubs, but with fewer secret handshakes and a lot more rules about when you're allowed to die. Among the Plains tribes, especially Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, these societies were the backbone of warfare and social control. Join one, and suddenly you weren't just fighting for yourself. You were bound by oaths, obligations, and an iron discipline that made your individuality about as useful as a blunt arrow. If your society went to battle, you went. If your society demanded you stand ground while everyone else retreated, you stood even if it meant certain death. Some groups, like the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers, literally staked themselves to the ground with rawhide ropes during fights, a living declaration that they would not move an inch until victory or death. It's the kind of commitment HR departments today can only dream of. And it wasn't just the battlefield. Warrior societies policed the village itself. They enforced discipline during hunts, kept order during ceremonies, and made sure food and spoils were distributed properly. Imagine a mix between a police force, a military unit, and the world's most judgmental neighborhood watch. If you got out of line, say, hoarding too much meat or disrespecting elders, they had the authority to punish you. And they didn't exactly hand out warning slips. Membership came with prestige, yes, but it also came with surveillance. Your behavior was no longer private. Other members scrutinized you constantly. Were you brave enough? Did you follow orders? Did you fulfill your duties in raids and rituals? Fail, and you risked disgrace. Excel, and you climbed the ranks, gaining the right to lead raids, paint your face in certain ways, or carry weapons reserved for the respected. But the societies weren't just bureaucratic chains, they were spiritual engines. They held ceremonies, danced in elaborate regalia, carried sacred bundles, and prayed for success in war. Your victories weren't yours alone. They were woven into the group's collective power. And that meant if you failed, you didn't just embarrass yourself, you risked weakening the entire society's standing with the spirits. Nothing like the weight of cosmic failure to keep you motivated. And then there was the politics. Warrior societies were power blocks inside the tribe, influencing leadership, steering raids, sometimes even sparking conflicts that reshaped history. To belong was to be at the center of things, but to belong also meant you couldn't walk away. You were claimed, body and spirit. So yes, warrior societies gave you prestige and brotherhood, but they also turned your life into a ledger of duty, discipline, and paranoia. You weren't just haunted by the scalps. You were monitored, evaluated, and bound to others whose oaths meant your mistakes could drag them down. And if you thought that kind of pressure was exhausting, Wait until you see what happened when the cycle of raids stopped being about society's keeping order and started spiraling into endless loops of revenge. Because once blood was spilled, balance demanded more blood, and that cycle never rested. Here's the thing about raids. They didn't end when the last arrow fell or the last scalp was taken. No, they had a nasty way of echoing forward, like a drumbeat that refused to fade. Because once blood was spilled, it cried out for balance, and balance meant revenge. What you thought was a victory today could be the seed of your death years from now. Welcome to the family business of feuding. Say you struck an enemy, stole horses, maybe even brought back a captive. Glory for you, grief for them. And grief demanded payment. Weeks later, maybe months, maybe years, their warriors would ride back, eyes fixed not just on horses or trophies, but on evening the score. Kill one of ours, we'll kill one of yours. Take our horses, we'll take them backhand a few more while we're at it. It was less one and done, and more like a spiral staircase made of blood, each step leading to another. And it wasn't just between tribes. Even within them, revenge shaped personal honor. If your brother fell in a raid, you were obligated to seek vengeance. Not avenging him wasn't just shameful, it was unthinkable. Your family's name depended on it. A man could be admired for many things: generosity, hunting skill, spiritual depth, but failed to avenge a relative, and your name turned sour in every mouth that spoke it. This cycle created wars that could last generations. Children grew up not just hearing stories of bravery, but also reciting lists of grievances. Which clan killed which uncle? Which raid ended in humiliation? Which feud still had unfinished business? You weren't just learning how to draw a bow, you were memorizing a blood ledger you'd be expected to help settle. Imagine bedtime stories that ended not with happily ever after, but, and that's why one day you'll have to kill a Pawnee. Sweet dreams, kid. And revenge wasn't always straightforward. Sometimes it was immediate, a quick strike back after a raid. Sometimes it simmered for decades, resurfacing when the opportunity was right. That's what made peace treaties so fragile. A council might agree to stop raiding, chiefs might smoke the pipe, but all it took was one man with a personal grievance to ride out and start the cycle all over again. Stability was never more than temporary. Violence was always lurking under the surface, like dry grass waiting for a spark. But here's the eerie part. Revenge didn't only honor the living, it honored the dead. By avenging a fallen relative, you ensured their spirit rested in peace. Failed to do so, and their ghost lingered, unsettled, maybe even hostile. In other words, your obligation to revenge wasn't just social, it was supernatural. You weren't only answering to your family, you were answering to the restless dead watching from the other side. So raids weren't isolated events, they were dominoes tipping each other endlessly. Your victory today guaranteed someone else's tomorrow. Your honor was a debt that could only be paid with more violence, and in that cycle, no one ever really won. The best you could do was keep moving, keep raiding, keep balancing the books, until death finally ended your role in the ledger. But of course, death wasn't always the only threat. Sometimes, the cycle wasn't just about ancient rivalries, it was fueled by something new. Europeans and colonists pouring gasoline on fires that already burned hot. So far, you've been raiding to settle old scores, to prove bravery, to snag a few horses. Hard enough already, but then the world tilts. Colonists arrive with steel, guns, diseases, and an uncanny ability to make everything more violent. Suddenly, your raids aren't just about honor or revenge, they're about survival in a collapsing world. Let's start with the weapons. Firearms trickled into native hands through trade, and at first, they were awkward and unreliable. But once you got past the learning curve of flintlocks and powder horns, they changed everything. A raid that might have been fought with bows and lances now roared with muskets. Tribes who secured steady access to European weapons gained massive advantages over rivals, and those who didn't, they became targets. Suddenly, raiding wasn't just tradition, it was an arms race. Then came the horses. Introduced by the Spanish in the 16th century, they spread north like wildfire, transforming warrior life. Raids became faster, larger, deadlier. Entire tribes reoriented around mounted warfare. Stealing horses wasn't just prestige anymore, it was strategic necessity. If you didn't have horses, you couldn't keep up. If you couldn't keep up, you didn't survive. And here's where colonial governments twisted the knife. Scalp bounties, French, British, and later American authorities literally offered money for enemy scalps, sometimes of rival tribes, sometimes of European enemies, sometimes of settlers. What had once been a ritualized practice tied to honor now became a gruesome paycheck. And when cash and trade goods were on the line, the violence escalated. Scalping spread farther, faster, and deeper than ever before. If you wanted to see capitalism at its most grotesque, this was it. An economy built on patches of human skin. Colonial expansion also squeezed tribes into tighter spaces. Old rivalries grew sharper as hunting grounds shrank. Game became scarce, and pressure mounted. Raids that might once have been seasonal escalated into near-constant warfare. What had been cycles of revenge morphed into desperate struggles for territory, food, and survival. And don't forget the role of allies. Tribes were drawn into European wars, sometimes willingly, sometimes by coercion. The French courted one alliance, the British another, the Americans yet another. Suddenly, you weren't just raiding because your uncle demanded revenge, you were raiding because some pale-skinned officer in a red coat had promised you guns, liquor, or protection if you struck his enemy first. Your world became entangled in conflicts you didn't start but couldn't escape. The irony is brutal. The arrival of Europeans both armed and destabilized native societies. Warrior life was magnified, intensified, and warped into something even bloodier. Raiding didn't stop, it accelerated. And if you thought the spiritual weight of carrying scalps was heavy before, imagine doing it now, when raids were no longer rare bursts of violence but near constant churn. The ghosts multiplied, the burdens deepened, and the warriors, they bore it all on their shoulders. But even the fiercest had limits, fighting constant wars, haunted by restless spirits, bound to vengeance, pressed by colonists. The strain seeped in, which brings us to something most people never think about, the psychological toll. What happens when the bravest man in camp lies awake at night, not from fear of enemies, but from the weight of his own ghosts? You've seen the songs, the parades, the painted faces returning from raids, but let's step closer. Inside the tent at night, when the fire burns low and no one's looking, that's where you'll find the part of warrior life nobody sings about, the toll it carved into the mind. Because bravery in daylight didn't mean the ghosts left you alone after dark. Start with the obvious. Killing isn't just a physical act, it's a spiritual transaction. Every enemy you struck down was believed to leave a trace, a shadow that didn't vanish with the body. That scalp on your belt wasn't just a symbol, it was a live wire to the soul of the dead. Even if you purified yourself in sweat lodges, smoked the pipe, or prayed to your guardian spirit, the dead had ways of lingering. Warriors spoke of nightmares where the faces of the slain appeared, eyes accusing, mouths silent but heavy with blame. And nightmares weren't just dreams, they were warnings. Fail to appease them, and you risked sickness, bad hunts, or sudden death. Then came the relentless pressure. Honor wasn't a wanting. Achievement, it was a currency that constantly depreciated. You couldn't just raid once and retire on your prestige. You had to keep proving yourself, raid after raid, year after year. Each success raised the bar higher. Each failure, hesitation in battle, cowardice in pain threatened to unravel everything. Living with that constant demand was like running with a spear pointed at your own back. And of course there was grief. For all the songs of bravery, warriors buried brothers, cousins, fathers, sons. Death wasn't abstract, it was daily. You avenged one loss, only to spark another, and the cycle chewed through your kin like a hungry fire. Some warriors turned cold, others reckless, but many carried quiet wounds no ritual could close. Even when they laughed at feasts or boasted after raids, their eyes gave them away hollow, restless, older than their years. Withdrawal became common. Some warriors fasted alone, seeking visions to cleanse themselves. Others sought medicine men, desperate for cures to illnesses that no poultice could explain, illnesses that were as much spirit as body. Still others drifted, unable to find peace in camp, haunted by the sense that the world of the living had grown too thin, that the dead pressed too close. And here's the irony. The same men who terrified enemies, who stood unflinching before pain, were often the most fragile when silence fell. Because silence had no audience, it was just you and the shadows you carried. The village praised you, yes, but only as long as you kept raiding, kept producing glory, kept feeding the cycle. Stop, and whispers began. Was he afraid? Has he lost his spirit? Is he cursed? respect could sour overnight, turning honor into suspicion. So the bravest faces in daylight often masked the most exhausted souls at night. Warriors lived like double-edged blade, sharp, admired, but liable to snap under their own weight. And the cruelest part, even when the raids slowed, even when colonial power stripped warrior life away, the inner battles didn't stop. Ghosts don't surrender to treaties. They follow you, whether you're in a saddle or on a reservation, humming the same relentless song. You killed, you lived, but are you free? And if you thought this toll might end once warriors stepped back from battle, think again. Because even as the old ways crumbled, the structures that demanded this endless cycle warrior societies didn't simply vanish. They adapted, lingering as shadows of the old discipline. So here you are, a man who's fought, raided, carried scalps, endured visions, and somehow survived long enough to watch the world change around you. And the change isn't subtle, it's catastrophic. The warrior ethos, once the backbone of your life and your people's identity, is collapsing under the weight of colonial expansion, US military campaigns, and confinement on reservations. If raids were once the heartbeat of existence, now you can hear that rhythm sputtering, growing faint. The decline didn't come all at once. First, horses and guns. Once the engines of raiding became tools of dependency, you needed traders for powder, settlers for markets, governments for treaties. The same raids that once built prestige now triggered devastating retaliation from armies with cannons and endless supplies. A warrior's courage couldn't stop a Gatling gun. Your skill on horseback meant little against railroads bringing waves of settlers who plowed under the land that fed both your people and your horses. Then came the treaties, pages of English words you couldn't read, signed under pressure, promising peace but delivering confinement. Raiding was declared outlawed, punishable not by counter-raids but by cavalry campaigns. Suddenly, what had been your sacred duty for generations proving bravery, avenging kin, defending land was redefined as criminal behavior by foreign governments. The very acts that once made you honorable now made you a target. And as reservation lines tightened, the old patterns unraveled. You couldn't ride out for horses anymore. The herds were gone, scattered or fenced. You couldn't steal back. Land it was parceled out, surveyed, sold. The cycles of revenge, the raids for prestige, even the midnight whispers of coup sticks clashing, all silenced under the iron discipline of colonial control. Warrior societies, once the enforcers of order and courage, were stripped of their authority. Some were outright banned. Others survived only as ceremonial shells, dancing at festivals, their oaths hollowed by the fact that there were no more raids to lead. For many warriors, this wasn't just loss of purpose, it was humiliation. You'd been raised your whole life to believe that manhood meant raiding, that bravery meant striking your enemy, that prestige meant scalps, horses, victories. Now you were told to farm, to sit still, to send your children to schools where their hair was cut and their language punished. Imagine being told the gods had built you to run like fire, only to be chained to a chair. The irony bites hard, and yet fragments of the ethos survived. Warrior societies adapted into new roles, guardians of ceremony, keepers of songs, protectors of memory. Bravery found new outlets, in the survival of culture, in the stubborn endurance of people who refused to vanish, and later, in native men who fought in foreign wars under US flags, carrying the echoes of their ancestors' ethos into trenches and battlefields half a world away. Still, for you, standing in that twilight moment, it felt like the end. The raids were gone, the horses thinned, the scalps outlawed, but the ghosts, they stayed. They always stayed. Because the decline of the warrior ethos didn't erase, it's weighted, just left it hanging heavier, like smoke with nowhere to drift. And when you died, you carried that with you into the afterlife. Which brings us to the final chapter of this story. Not life in the saddle, not raids in the night, but what awaited you once your body was laid down and the restless spirits came to collect their dues. So, you finally collapse. Maybe in battle, maybe in old age, maybe in some coughing fit after years of carrying too many spirits on your belt. And you might expect that at last, the weight lifts, that death gives you a quiet rest. But no, if you'd lived as a warrior, your journey wasn't done. Death was only the next battlefield, because your conduct in life didn't just shape your reputation, it determined your afterlife. Among many tribes, bravery was more than social currency, it was spiritual insurance. Die well, with honor, and you could join your ancestors, hunt in eternal plains, feast in the lodges of the dead, die poorly, cowardice, disgrace, failure to avenge your kin, and you risked wandering, restless, caught between worlds, not so much punished as unfinished, a ghost adrift with no songs to carry you forward. And it wasn't only your own fate at stake. The living carried responsibility for you. Rituals had to be done properly, words spoken, prayers offered to ease your passage. A botched burial could tether you to the earth, your spirit looping through camps, whispering at night, tugging at dreams. Families dreaded dishonor, not just because it stained their name, but because it meant inheriting an unsettled ghost. The scalps you took in life could follow you, too. Some believed the spirits of those you'd slain might wait for you in death, demanding repayment, clawing for balance. Imagine entering the other world, only to find every face you'd taken staring back at you, silent, patient, eternal. Death wasn't a clean erasure, it was an audit, and the books had to be balanced. But here's the haunting irony. While the warrior ethos declined under colonial rule, its legacies refused to vanish. Ghost dances, powwow songs, warrior societies reborn as veterans, groups all carried fragments of the old ways. Bravery redefined itself, shifting from raids to survival, from war parties to preserving culture. Yet the shadows of the old ethos lingered. The scalps, the raids, the restless spirits, they became part of memory, of history, of the stories whispered to children who would never ride into battle, but still carried the echoes of those who had. And today, when veterans dance in regalia at powwows, when songs are sung for those who fought in foreign wars, you can hear it, the old heartbeat, transformed but not erased. The dark side of warrior life never vanished. It seeped into the cracks of legacy, half shadow, half shadow. So no, death didn't free you entirely. It folded you into a story larger than yourself, one written in blood and balance, in scalps and spirits, in cycles of revenge that outlived empires. You were remembered not just as a man, but as a link in a chain that refused to break. A chain humming still with the restless energy of 1,000 raids. And that's the truth of it. Even in the afterlife, the warrior never really rests. The spirits don't forget, the songs don't stop, and the weight of honor keeps pressing, long after the last arrow's been loosed. Honor was never a private thing. It wasn't some quiet feeling you carried inside, like pride in a well-cooked stew, or satisfaction at fixing your sandals before they fell apart. No, honor lived outside the body. It was a public currency, fragile and loud, traded in stories, scars, and the watchful eyes of everyone else. Across warrior societies, from the plains of North America to the valleys of Greece, people didn't care what you felt about yourself. They cared what you showed. A man could boast all he wanted about being brave, but until he stepped into danger, bared his chest, and flirted with death, his words were as cheap as dust. Honor existed only in evidence, and evidence meant risk. This made combat less about survival and more about performance. Communities were small, memories were long, and gossip was merciless. The way someone acted in a fight would be recited around fires for decades, turned into examples for children, and stitched into song. To hesitate, to retreat, to cower, it was a stain no ritual could fully erase. Meanwhile, charging forward, even if it ended in your death, purchased a kind of immortality. People remembered, they always remembered. That's why cowardice was considered worse than dying. Death was inevitable. Dishonor was optional, and yet far more permanent. The body could fall and be buried, but shame lingered, whispered long after bones turned to dust. Anthropologists studying oral traditions often notice this imbalance. The names of the brave are preserved for centuries, while the names of cowards dissolve almost immediately, like salt in water. To be forgotten entirely was, in its own way, the cruelest afterlife. Honor's public nature meant it wasn't just about warfare, it seeped into everything. Who could marry, who could lead, who could speak and counsel, it all hinged on the ledger of courage. And unlike wealth or land, this currency couldn't be inherited. Each man had to earn it for himself, usually at the edge of a blade or in the arc of an arrow. It's unsettling, really, how fragile it all was. One act of bravery might elevate you, but one slip could undo it. entire lifetimes of courage could be overshadowed by a single rumor of hesitation. And because everyone knew this, men chased danger the way merchants chased profit, constantly, nervously, obsessively. But what counted as courage? What act was enough to tilt the scales in your favor? That question haunted every warrior culture, and the answer was surprisingly consistent across continents. Courage wasn't about what you survived, but about how close you came to death while proving you deserved to live. And that brings us to the next layer, the strange equation between honor and courage, and how facing death wasn't a byproduct of bravery, but its very definition. Courage wasn't an abstract word tucked neatly into philosophy scrolls or whispered in sermons. It was a test scored in real time, and the judges were everyone who watched. Across cultures, it didn't matter if a man had skill, wealth, or cunning without courage. He was unfinished, like a pot that cracked in the kiln. And courage, inconveniently, was always measured against death. Among the Plains tribes, the highest form of bravery wasn't even killing an enemy, it was counting coup, riding straight up to him, touching him with a coup stick, and galloping away untouched. The point wasn't slaughter, it was proximity. Anyone could kill from a distance, but to close the gap, to look an enemy in the eye and brush him like he was a target in a children's game, that was courage. Death hovered close enough to breathe on your cheek, and you proved you didn't flinch. The Greeks, in their own theater of war, kept the same logic. The hoplites' courage wasn't measured in individual duels, but in standing firm in the phalanx, shoulder to shoulder, when every instinct screamed to turn and run. Cowards broke rank, creating gaps that killed their comrades. The man who stood, even as spears whistled toward him, embodied the only courage that mattered, the courage that ignored survival. Zulu warriors in southern Africa carried the same arithmetic. Boys were trained to fight with sticks long before they held spears, learning that bruises and cuts weren't inconveniences but investments. Courage was physical proof carved into the body, each scar a credential. You couldn't cheat the system. The only way to acquire honor was to stand where pain and death were closest, and refuse to yield. And that's the pattern. Courage meant demonstrating, publicly, that you were willing to stand in death's shadow without blinking. Not recklessly, suicide was wasteful, but visibly, theatrically, defiantly, the community had to see it. Courage without witnesses was worthless. It's why men leaped forward in battles, why warriors recited their deeds in songs, why scars were displayed like medals. They weren't courting death for death's sake, they were courting proof. There's an eerie irony in it. Survival was essential for communities, but survival alone didn't make you respected. The most honored men were the ones who danced with annihilation, the ones whose bravery balanced on the thin edge between triumph and corpse. If you stepped too far into safety, you were branded a coward. If you stepped too far into recklessness and died foolishly, you wasted your life. The true courage lay in that middle ground, close enough to death to prove yourself, but clever enough to walk back out. And so every boy grew up with this unspoken promise carved into his future. One day, he'd be called to face death, not to avoid it, but to brush against it. Only then would he be considered whole. Which is why so many cultures placed the first true test of courage in initiation. Right's the moment when a boy stopped being a child and proved himself worthy of joining the ranks of men. The first real measure of courage wasn't found in the thick of war, but in the rehearsals, those brutal coming-of-age trials designed to strip away childhood and replace it with something harder, sharper, more acceptable to the community. These weren't sweet 16s or graduation parties. They were blood baptisms where pain and fear were the tutors, and everyone was watching to see if you cracked. Among the Spartans, initiation meant the agoge, years of cold, hunger, and deliberate humiliation. A boy might be ordered to steal food, but punished savagely if caught not, because theft was forbidden, but because cowardly failure was. Courage here wasn't about morality. It was about enduring beatings without whimpering, training the body to accept pain as casually as breathing. Only then could he take his place in the phalanx, where death pressed close enough to fog his helmet. The Zulu had their own first blood ritual, stick fighting. Boys squared off, trading blows until welts and cuts painted their skin. Losing wasn't shameful, but refusing to fight was. Courage was etched into the body long before spears and shields came into play. Every scar a down payment toward manhood. And across the Great Plains, the first raid was the rite of passage. Young men weren't expected to slaughter enemies outright. They were expected to risk to ride close, to count coup, to snatch a horse or weapon from under the enemy's nose. The elders judged not the kill, but the audacity. A boy who charged forward recklessly might die and be praised. One who hung back too cautiously lived, but carried a shadow that stuck to him like smoke. These initiations weren't side notes. They were essential mechanisms of survival. Communities needed warriors who could stare at death without flinching, and the only way to guarantee that was to expose boys early, test their nerves, and publicly rank their courage. The group couldn't afford hesitation in battle, so hesitation in initiation was punished with scorn. The cruelty wasn't arbitrary. It was pedagogy. Pain was instruction. Fear was curriculum. By demanding first blood from the young, societies tried to ensure that when real battles came, when arrows hissed and spears clashed, men wouldn't freeze. They would remember the sting of the cane, the bruise of the stick, the rush of touching an enemy in their first raid, and step forward anyway. And once you'd passed that trial, once your body carried its first sanctioned wounds, you were never the same. You were now bound to the logic that had trained you. That honor could only ever be purchased by standing close to danger, which is why, in so many traditions, true prestige came not from killing at a distance, but from proximity, the dangerous intimacy of facing your enemy up close. In warrior cultures across the world, there was a common rule, whispered, sung, and lived. The closer you were to the enemy, the more honorable the act. Distance diluted courage. To kill from afar was useful, but to stand so close that you could see the sweat on your enemy's face, that was where honor bloomed. On the North American plains, this principle took its most dramatic form in counting coup. Warriors risked everything not by killing but by touching an enemy and escaping alive. A feather tied to a coup stick wasn't just decoration, it was a receipt for audacity. Imagine leaning forward in full gallop, brushing a man armed with a bow, and riding off grinning while arrows chased your back. Killing proved you were deadly. Touching proved you didn't fear death at all. The Aztecs had their own version. Capturing enemies alive in hand-to-hand combat was valued more than killing them outright. Why? Because prisoners fed the ritual engine of sacrifice back home. Facing an enemy blade to blade and wrestling him into captivity demanded far more courage than a quick spear thrust. A warrior's rank could rise on the number of captives he delivered, not the corpses he left behind. Even in ancient Greece, the same calculus applied. The hoplite in the phalanx didn't win honor by flinging javelins from a distance. His worth was measured in how firmly he held the line, shoulder pressed to shoulder, spear leveled inches from the enemy's chest. Courage was the refusal to yield when death's breath steamed the air between two shields. The logic was consistent. Distance insulated you, and insulation looked suspiciously like fear. Standing close stripped away that protection. It forced you into intimacy with danger, where one mistake meant obliteration. To choose that space willingly marked you as different, elevated, honorable. It wasn't that archers or long-range fighters had no value, they often decided battles. But their prestige was lower, their stories quieter. Oral traditions rarely immortalized the man who loosed arrows from a hill. They praised the one who rode into the storm and emerged with proof whether a coup feather, a captive, or a scar that never fully closed. And this closeness created theater. Battles weren't just contests of strategy. They were stages where courage had to be displayed visibly. Warriors lunged forward, knowing full well they might die, because hesitation looked worse than a corpse. It was better to risk a wound at arm's length than to be remembered as the man who lingered at the edges. Safe, but forgettable. Which leads naturally to the next paradox. Sometimes, the bravest acts didn't even involve killing at all. In many cultures, the symbolic gesture and audacious move that risked death without delivering, it was the purest proof of courage. Honor didn't always demand a corpse. Sometimes, the most celebrated acts were the ones that left the enemy alive but humiliated. Proof that you had touched the edge of death and come back laughing. Symbolism carried more weight than sheer body count. On the Great Plains, counting coup was the classic example. To gallop into a storm of arrows, lean down from horseback, and tap an enemy with a coup stick before fleeing unharmed. This wasn't lunacy, it was artistry. Killing the man would have been simpler, but simplicity didn't impress anyone. The entire point was to court danger without succumbing to it. A feather added to your coup stick told the story. I went there, I touched death, and I came back untouched. In Homeric Greece, Warriors sought Clear's glory that lived in song. That meant not just victory, but gestures of theatrical courage. A man might strip the armor from a fallen enemy in the middle of the battlefield, exposing himself to attack from all sides, just to prove his disdain for safety. The act wasn't practical. It was performative, a visible sneer at mortality. The Celts, too, prized gestures that blurred into performance. Ancient writers describe warriors charging naked into battle, painted blue, shouting insults while weapons glinted in the sun. Fighting without armor wasn't strategic brilliance, it was a message. Look how little I fear your blades. The act itself became symbolic currency. Bravery turned into spectacle. And then there was the retrieval of the dead. In many cultures, dragging a fallen comrade's body back from under enemy fire was seen as an ultimate act of courage. It gained no material reward, no horses, no captives, no trophies, but it demonstrated loyalty and fearlessness in the face of death. To risk your own life for the dignity of another body was proof that honor outweighed self-preservation. These symbolic acts mattered because they inverted logic. Killing an enemy eliminated him. Yes, but it was expected. It didn't astonish. Risking yourself unnecessarily, touching, taunting, exposing, retrieving was unexpected, excessive, and therefore memorable. The story could be told and retold, embroidered into song, preserved in memory. Honor wasn't about efficiency. It was about theater, and theater always demanded risk. But of course, symbolic gestures often left their mark, not just on memory, but on the flesh. Because the body itself became a ledger, where courage was recorded in cuts, bruises, and scars, the permanent reminders that honor demanded pain as its currency. If courage was a currency, then pain was the coin it was minted from. The body itself became the ledger, and every cut, welt, or scar was a line of proof that you had paid your dues. Honor wasn't just won in the moment. Cliff was etched into skin for everyone to see. Across the Great Plains, a warrior might pierce his chest with skewers during the Sundance, tethering himself to a central pole by rawhide thongs. The act wasn't about spectacle for outsiders. It was about showing endurance, proving you could withstand agony without flinching. The more you bled, the more people respected you. Pain was translated into spiritual and social capital, a down payment on future honor. Zulu boys entered manhood through stick fighting, where welts and cuts weren't shameful but celebrated. Each mark was a credentialing, evidence that you had stood your ground. You didn't need to brag, the bruises did it for you. Similarly, in some Amazonian groups, boys endured ant-filled gloves, their hands plunged into writhing insects that bit and stung for minutes on end. To scream was disgrace. To endure was to prove you could carry the burden of adulthood. The Greeks understood this too, though their methods were different. In Sparta, boys were flogged at the altar of Artemis Orthia, sometimes to the point of death. To endure without crying out wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake, was a demonstration, a public exam, graded in silence. The more stoically you bled, the more the community believed you had the courage to stand unflinching in battle. And scars became biography. They were stories written on flesh. Among the Dinka of Sudan, ritual scarification wasn't just decoration, it was proof that you had endured the knife without trembling, that you were worthy of respect. Every line carved into the forehead told the community, here is someone who can bear pain, and therefore someone who can bear honor. This economy of suffering wasn't irrational. Communities relied on warriors to face real danger, to hold the line when death pressed in. Pain rituals rehearsed that reality, tested it, displayed it. They transformed invisible qualities, courage, resilience, into visible proof. Without scars, how could anyone be sure? And so the logic hardened. To be honorable, you had to hurt. Comfort bred suspicion. Ease was cowardice. The body had to carry evidence of suffering, otherwise the community assumed it hadn't been tested. Which is why death itself, accepted openly, endured publicly, became the final and most convincing proof of courage. For all the scars and the rituals, for all the bruises that served as social credentials, there was still one exam no one escaped: death. And in many warrior cultures, how you died mattered far more than how you lived. To collapse quietly, to beg, to scream, these erased decades of bravery. To face the end with a steady gaze, that was the gold standard of honor. Take the Plains warriors again. It wasn't uncommon for a man, cornered in battle, to sing his death song before charging the enemy one last time. The point wasn't survival, it was defiance. His community would remember the words, his enemies would remember the audacity, and his honor would outlast his body. Cowardice might keep you breathing longer, but in the cruel arithmetic of honor, it was the braver corpse who lived forever in memory. Among the Norse, dying with a weapon in hand wasn't just a matter of prestige, it was a ticket to Valhalla. A man who fell in bed, sick and wasted, might be mourned, but he wasn't celebrated. The sagas praised those who stood tall in their final moments, even taunting death with laughter, as if the right attitude could reshape fate itself. The Celts, too, carried this obsession. Roman chroniclers wrote of Celtic warriors who smiled in the face of execution, hurling insults at their captors. To endure death without fear wasn't just personal pride, it was a statement for the entire community. Courage transcended flesh. Honor survived even in severed heads. And then there were the tortured captives among some Native American tribes. Here, death wasn't quick. It was prolonged, public, ritualized. The victim's job wasn't to escape it, but to face it with dignity, mocking his tormentors, refusing to cry out. If he succeeded, his enemies might hate him, but they also respected him. His people, hearing the story later, would treat his death not as defeat, but as a kind of victory. What united all of this was the simple belief that death was inevitable, but dishonor was not. Since you couldn't escape dying, you might as well choreograph it into something memorable. Communities depended on those stories. They repeated them at feasts, wove them into songs, raised children on them. The manner of death became a legacy, an inheritance of courage for the living. But death was never an isolated act. It always bled into the lives of others. A brave death demanded vengeance, an obligation that kept cycles of violence spinning for generations, which meant that every honorable end also lit the fuse for the next eruption of blood. Death never stayed neatly in the grave. In warrior societies, it spilled forward, demanding repayment. To lose a kinsman wasn't just grief, it was debt, and that debt could only be cleared with blood. Revenge wasn't an option. It was an obligation woven into the very definition of honor. Among the Iroquois, the death of a warrior called for ritualized vengeance. Raids weren't only about resources, they were about restoring balance. Each life lost tilted the cosmic ledger, and it was the responsibility of the living to set it right. The same logic pulsed through the Plains tribes, where mourning songs often doubled as war songs, grief transforming seamlessly into fuel for the next raid. The Greeks codified this in their myths. Think of Achilles, raging after the death of Patroclus. His honor demanded not patience or mourning, but slaughter. To leave the wound unanswered would have branded him less than a man. In Homer's world, revenge wasn't just narrative spice, it was the ethical foundation of courage. And in the Balkans, for centuries, blood feuds Juk Maria among Albania's structured entire communities. Families carried obligations across generations, sometimes hunting down the great-grandson of the man who had once killed an ancestor. Forgetting wasn't just weakness, it was dishonor. To fail to avenge was to live in permanent disgrace. This cycle of revenge had a chilling logic. Every act of bravery created its mirror. Kill a man and his kin rose to avenge him. Avenge him, and you created another wound demanding another act of courage. Violence folded back on itself endlessly, a spiral no treaty or truce could fully break. Honor demanded the cycle continue, because to stop meant admitting cowardice. And it wasn't only social, it was spiritual. The dead were restless until avenged. Their spirits pressed on the living, whispering in dreams, shadowing warriors until someone answered their call. To ignore revenge was to risk angering both the community and the other world. Justice wasn't about courts or negotiation. Justice was your cousin sharpening his blade in the night. Of course, this meant communities lived in a constant state of low-grade tension, always one insult or injury away from war. Alliances were fragile, peace temporary. Everyone carried the weight of memory, long lists of wrongs to be balanced. And balance, in this logic, always meant blood. But there was another layer to this cycle, the belief that courage wasn't just social or political, it had cosmic implications. By avenging the dead and facing death yourself, you weren't just serving your people, you were keeping the universe from unraveling. And that belief pulled courage into a higher register, one that touched the realm of the gods and spirits. For many warrior societies, courage wasn't only about reputation among the living, it reached into the invisible, where ancestors, spirits, and gods were thought to be watching every move. To fight bravely was to align yourself with cosmic order. To falter was to throw the universe off balance. Among the Lakota, the sun dance wasn't just about endurance for endurance's sake. It was a way to renew the world, to show the spirits that men could suffer willingly for the people. Courage in pain wasn't private piety, it was spiritual currency, offered upward as proof of devotion. A warrior who failed to face suffering dishonored not only himself, but risked his entire community's relationship with the sacred. The Aztecs pushed this belief into full theater. Dying in battle or being sacrificed was the highest honor because it fed the sun. Without such deaths, the universe itself risked collapse. Courage wasn't just admired, which was cosmological maintenance. To retreat in battle was unthinkable, not because it disappointed your comrades, but because it endangered creation itself. Even in the Norse world, bravery was framed through spiritual consequence. To fall sword in hand was to be chosen by the Valkyries, carried into Valhalla. To die quietly, without courage, condemned you to hella colder, duller afterlife. It wasn't just about what others thought, it was about where your soul was headed. And across many indigenous traditions in North America, the spirits of the slain lingered. To kill without courage, or to dishonor the enemy, risked their wrath. A warrior had to treat death with seriousness, purifying himself after battle, offering tobacco, or engaging in rituals to prevent vengeful spirits from haunting him. In this sense, courage was as much about spiritual hygiene as social recognition. The weight was immense. Every raid, every duel, every wound wasn't just a personal trial. It was theater for the ancestors, a test set by gods, a negotiation with the restless dead. Courage made the invisible world nod in approval. Cowardice, that risked drawing curses, sickness, or drought. This spiritual layer explains why honor seemed to demand extremes. Ordinary bravery wasn't enough when the balance of the cosmos was supposedly on the line. Warriors didn't just touch death for themselves, they did it to prove their people were still aligned with the sacred order. And in that sense, the only thing more terrifying than dying was being forgotten, spiritually unanchored, erased from the chain of memory. Which leads us straight to the last and most haunting truth. In these societies, honor outlived flesh. Death wasn't an erasure, it was an audition for eternity, where reputation became the only immortality that mattered. Death was never the end. In warrior societies, it was just the last performance, and what followed depended entirely on how convincingly you played your role. Because honor didn't rot with the body, it either lingered in song or it evaporated into silence. Among the Plains tribes, a warrior's deeds were remembered through winter counts, painted histories on hides where battles, raids, and acts of courage were recorded year by year. Your name might vanish, but your act touching an enemy, rescuing a comrade, singing your death song became an image carried forward. To be included was a form of immortality. To be excluded was erasure. The Greeks codified this in their obsession with Clio's glory, preserved in poetry. Achilles himself knew he'd die young if he sought honor, but he chose it anyway, because a short life sung forever was worth more than a long life swallowed by obscurity. His calculus wasn't unique, echoed the logic of cultures everywhere. Better a brief blaze remembered than a slow fade forgotten. For the Norse, sagas served the same role. A man's courage in battle was retold for generations, shaping not just how he was remembered, but how his descendants were treated. To die well wasn't only for yourself, it lifted your entire bloodline. Cowardice, on the other hand, could stain kin for years. Your weakness became their inheritance. And in many indigenous traditions of the Americas, songs preserved honor long after bodies were gone. Death songs weren't just for the moment of dying, they were rehearsals for memory. To sing boldly on the edge of death was to script your afterlife, ensuring the community carried your courage forward in story. But here's the sting. Memory was selective. Societies didn't preserve everyone equally. Acts of bravery carved into history. Acts of cowardice disappeared into silence. Forgetting wasn't mercy, it was punishment. To die dishonorably meant not just social shame, but cosmic exile, as if the community itself conspired to delete you from existence. So warriors didn't just face death, they faced judgment by memory. Their true afterlife wasn't in distant heavens or shadowy underworlds, but in the mouths of those who told their stories. Honor was the only immortality on offer, and the only way to secure it was to touch death, again and again, until the final encounter sealed your fate. Which is why, across cultures and centuries, the same lesson repeats. courage wasn't about avoiding the grave. It was about shaping how people would speak your name once you lay inside it. And in that relentless pursuit of memory, men found themselves riding into danger, welcoming scars, and singing defiantly to the very edge of silence. Before blades crossed, before arrows were loosed, men began with movement. A war dance wasn't decoration, it was a primer, the first strike before the real strike. The rhythm of drums or stomping feet set bodies into motion, and with motion came focus. Muscles tightened, lungs expanded, hearts raced in unison. Fear didn't vanish, it was disciplined, folded into the beat. Across the Great Plains, warriors painted their bodies, sang loudly, and stomped around fires in circles that were half ritual, half training. What looked like chaos to an outsider was calibration. The body was tuning itself, learning to channel adrenaline into rhythm. By the time the dance ended, the men were no longer scattered individuals, they were vibrating at the same pitch. Among the Maori, the haka became a storm before the storm. Warriors slapped their chests, rolled their eyes, and shouted words that weren't just noise but declarations. The intimidation worked both ways. It wasn't only for the enemy. It reminded the dancers themselves that they weren't frail humans about to risk death. They were a force, a wall of rhythm and sound. Even the Zulu used martial dances to steel themselves. Shield in one hand, spear in the other. They moved in coordinated bursts, steps rehearsed until they felt like muscle memory. The body, once loosened by the dance, was less likely to hesitate when it mattered, and hesitation, in battle, was a luxury no one could afford. War dancers did the practical work of burning fear into fuel. The shaking legs, the pounding chests, the call and response chants, they created a physiological storm that tricked the body into readiness. By the time the dance stopped, the warriors were no longer men debating their mortality. They were bodies already in motion, hearts already racing, death already courted. But the steps weren't only about warming muscle and mind. They were about raising voices loud enough to reach the unseen, calling out into the dark spaces where ancestors and gods might be listening. And that's where the dance slipped from preparation into prayer. Every stomp, every shout, every gesture was more than exercise. It was a message. The dance, layered with song and breath, carried words upward and outward, toward ancestors, spirits, gods, whoever was thought to be watching from the invisible side. Warriors weren't just limbering up, they were dialing the cosmic line. Among the plains peoples, the beat of the drum wasn't random, it was the heartbeat of the universe itself. When men circled the fire, stamping the earth in time, they weren't just moving their feet, they were asking for the favor of the spirits that guarded the hunt and the warpath. Each painted figure became a petition, a visible prayer written not with ink but with sweat and dust. In Polynesia, war dances were chanted invocations as much as intimidation. The words named ancestors invoked their strength and folded their memory into the present. The living borrowed the courage of the dead, announcing that those who fought before were fighting again through them. The loud voices weren't just theater, they were bridges. And in West Africa, drumming paired with war dances built a spiritual channel. The rhythm wasn't accompaniment, it was summoning. Deities like Ogun, patron of iron and war, were called not with speeches but with movement and beat. Warriors lifted their weapons in ritual steps that blurred the line between choreography and liturgy. The body became the instrument of worship. Arms rose to mimic prayers. Feet struck earth as if demanding attention from below. Faces painted with designs that weren't just decoration, but signatures recognizable to spirits. The whole performance said, "We are here, we are ready, do not forget us." This wasn't about humility, it was about insistence. Dancers claimed divine favor loudly, defiantly, as if the gods themselves needed a reminder to look down and pay attention. No one wanted to march into danger unacknowledged. If men were about to risk spilling their blood, they wanted assurance that some higher presence was listening. But prayer didn't only mean asking, it often meant becoming. Because in many traditions, the next step after invocation was imitation, letting the body slip into the shapes and movements of the very beings being called. And that's where the dance crossed the threshold into transformation. Once the prayers had been shouted, the next step was embodiment. The body stopped being just a man's body and started borrowing shapes from the world of spirits, animals, and myth. War dances blurred the line between human and otherworldly, as if the safest way to fight death was to stop being entirely human for a while. On the plains, warriors often painted themselves as eagles or buffalo, moving in ways that echoed those animals' strength. The eagle's circling swoop, the buffalo's stomping rush, these weren't just metaphors. They were rehearsals for becoming something larger than flesh, something predators and prey alike respected. To mimic the animal was to channel its spirit, to step into battle wearing its invisible armor. The Maori haka wasn't only about intimidation through shouts and grimaces. The bulging eyes, the extended tongue, the stamping feet, these gestures carried ancestral echoes. They weren't random. They were codified mimicries of beings from myth, designed to summon that ferocity into the present moment. Every distorted face said, "I am not just myself. I am the spirit of those who came before." In sub-Saharan Africa, many war dancers folded animal mimicry into the rhythm. The leap of the leopard, the sway of the antelope, the crash of the elephantol performed not for entertainment but as a kind of possession. To move like the creature was, to invite its essence into the body, to carry it forward into battle. And the logic was simple. Humans alone were too fragile. Flesh tore easily, bones broke. But if, through movement and paint, a man could half become eagle, buffalo, jaguar, ancestor, or god, then death might hesitate, at least long enough for the spear to land first. The imitation also served another purpose. It announced transformation. Once the dance began, the men weren't ordinary sons, brothers, or husbands. They had stepped across a threshold. They weren't human in the usual sense anymore. They were warriors, bound to the supernatural by gesture, costume, and rhythm. The everyday self had been stripped away, replaced with a figure meant to frighten, impress, and endure. And in that stripped-down state, they were ready to cross into the next phase. The dangerous transformation from human into something entirely liminal, neither ordinary men nor fully divine, but beings poised between, made possible by dance. The moment the drums quickened and the body paint dried, men were no longer themselves. A war dance wasn't a pastime, it was a threshold. Crossing it meant leaving behind ordinary identities and husband, farmer, herder, and stepping into a temporary but frightening role, warrior. The dance announced this shift loudly, so no one could miss it. Among the plains tribes, a man who joined the war dance had already accepted he might not return. His face painted with sacred symbols, his movements rehearsed from generations before. He wasn't entering battle as a private individual, but as a vessel of his people's will. The dance stripped him of his ordinary skin and clothed him in something heavier: responsibility, risk, divine expectation. The Maori haka worked similarly. A man reciting genealogy during the chant wasn't just bragging. He was pulling the presence of his ancestors into his body, declaring that their bloodline now stood in him, ready to fight. By the time the haka ended, he wasn't just Te Raparaha or Hone or Wairamu. He was the sum of his lineage, sharpened into one terrifying edge. Zulu regiments went further, pairing dance with full costume, cowhide shields, feathered headdresses, spears gleaming in the sun. A young man stepping into that rhythm became unrecognizable, his movements coordinated with hundreds of others until individuality dissolved. The transformation wasn't metaphorical, it was visible. This passage from human to warrior wasn't subtle, it was theater meant to make it undeniable. Everyone watching, family, elders, children, enemies, could see the metamorphosis take place. It removed hesitation. Once the steps were taken, once the song was sung, there was no going back. To back out after dancing was worse than cowardice, it was spiritual treason. Breaking a pact you had already sealed with your own body. And there was a collective safety in this transformation. Fear belonged to ordinary men. Warriors was something else, and the dance carved that distinction into bone. By the end, the group wasn't a crowd of nervous individuals. It was a single force, fused by rhythm, bound by paint, and terrifying in its uniformity. That collective bond, born from rhythm and synchronized bodies, carried them into the next essential layer of war dancers: unity. Because one man's courage was impressive, but an entire regiment breathing and stomping as one now, that was supernatural. Once the threshold was crossed, something uncanny happened. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of bodies fell into the same beat. Feet struck earth at the same instant. Voices rose in unison. Spears shook to the same rhythm. The war dance took fragile, anxious individuals and welded them into a single organism. Fear, when shared and synchronized, lost its bite. The Zulu regiments perfected this. Hundreds of men stamping shields, spears lifted in precise rhythm, their steps echoing like thunder over the hills. It wasn't just training, it was enchantment. Anyone watching, even their enemies, would see less a line of men and more a storm given legs. The cohesion wasn't symbolic, it was practical. Men who had moved together in dance could move together in battle, instinctively, without hesitation. On the Maori battlefield, the haka created the same effect. The shouts, the chest slaps, the guttural chants terrifying not just for opponents but binding for the performers. Every man carried his own fear, but as the group shouted it out together, it became something else. Energy, individually fragile, collectively unbreakable. Among Plains tribes, the smaller circles around fires accomplished a similar task. Dancers mirrored one another, the rhythm of drums pulling everyone into the same current. Horses stamped alongside, as if even the animals understood. The circle erased individuality. One man faltering didn't matter, because the rhythm carried him. This was the genius of the war dance. It reprogrammed the body. No one marched into battle thinking, I alone must survive. The rhythm trained them to think, we are one body, and it must not break. The enemy didn't face individuals, they faced a living chorus, its movements drilled into unity before the first spear was even raised. And that unity was more than strategy, it was spiritual armor. A group breathing and moving together became something other than human. To onlookers, it was as if the ancestors themselves had possessed the dancers, fusing them into a single supernatural being. But the dance didn't stop at group psychology. It carried the warriors further, pressing them past ordinary awareness. With drums pounding and feet relentless, bodies slipped into altered states, where the line between human and spirit blurred completely. The rhythm wasn't just noise, it was a doorway, long enough under the drum, deep enough in the stomp, and the body stopped belonging to itself. Movements repeated until they erased thought, leaving only breath, pulse, and vibration. What outsiders saw as exhaustion was often described by the dancers themselves as crossing over, slipping into a state where the boundary between warrior and spirit thinned. On the plains, warriors spoke of visions arriving in the middle of the dance. The sudden flash of an ancestor's face, a voice offering guidance, a dreamlike certainty of protection. These weren't accidents of fatigue, they were cultivated, expected. The war dance was designed to carry men past the limits of the ordinary, where communication with the unseen became possible. In West Africa, trance through dance and drumming was central to warfare's spiritual preparation. Possession wasn't feared, it was sought. To be seized by Ogun, the Orisha of iron and war, meant entering battle with his ferocity flowing through your limbs. The altered state wasn't madness, it was weaponry, armor thicker than any shield. Among Polynesian groups, the intensity of chants and movements could produce a similar effect. Trembling limbs, widened eyes, voices strained to otherworldly pitches. In those moments, warriors weren't themselves, they were vessels. The ancestors had arrived, and the ordinary self was displaced to make room. Anthropologists who observed these states often described them clinically hallucinations, hyperventilation, adrenaline. But to those inside, the meaning was clear. You weren't alone. The dance had summoned company from the invisible, and that company would march with you into danger. Trance was more than mystical entertainment, it recalibrated fear. A man no longer believed he carried only his own fragile body. He carried the weight of spirits, gods, animals, all lending strength. Facing death became less terrifying if you weren't really just yourself anymore. And once the spirits had entered, the next task was to keep them close to, wrap them around the warriors like protection, which is why dances so often doubled as acts of cleansing, burning off weakness and weaving invisible shields before the first spear was raised. If trance opened the door, cleansing kept the threshold secure. War dances weren't only about summoning strength, they were about scrubbing away everything that might weaken it. Fear, doubt, bad omens, lingering shadows from past battles, these needed to be shaken off, stomped out, exhaled into the dust. On the Great Plains, warriors circled fires with painted bodies, singing loudly enough to drown hesitation. The stomping and chanting weren't just bravado. They were purification, a deliberate stripping away of weakness. Sweat itself was understood as medicine, each drop carrying off a trace of fear. leaving the body lighter, cleaner. Zulu regiments carried shields and spears into ritual dances, not just to rehearse movement, but to consecrate the weapons. The act of dancing with them lifting, striking, shaking wasn't mere practice. It was washing the iron in rhythm, binding it to the supernatural, so that in battle it would cut with more than physical force. Among Polynesian groups, cleansing was woven into chants that called out curses and drove them off. The stamping feet weren't only intimidation, they were a way of driving misfortune into the ground, pinning it beneath the soles of the dancers so it couldn't follow into battle. This layer of protection mattered because war was understood as more than physical. Enemies didn't just throw spears, they threw curses, carried bad spirits, wielded unseen dangers. To walk into that field unprotected was like stepping into a storm without a cloak. The dance became that cloak, an invisible armor sewn from sound, movement, and sweat. The purifying aspect also made the warriors untouchable in another sense. By the time the dance ended, they weren't just armed, they were ritually sealed. The community watching them knew they had passed through fire and come out cleansed. Nothing unworthy remained. They were ready to carry not only weapons, but the dangerous weight of supernatural power. And once the protection was woven tight, the dance turned outward. Because it wasn't enough to feel strong, you had to show it. You had to display the power so convincingly that even enemies, standing at the edge of the field, might feel the spirits looming behind your painted face. By the time the cleansing was done, the dance was no longer private. It turned outward, swelling into theater and art form sharpened into intimidation. War dances were meant to be seen, not just by allies who needed reassurance, but by enemies who needed to feel small before the first weapon was even raised. The Maori haka is the most famous example. Eyes rolled wide, tongues thrust out, bodies quivering with exaggerated force. The gestures weren't random, they were a vocabulary of threat, meant to remind opponents that they faced not men but a lineage of ancestors pounding through the present. To stand across from a haka was to feel courage leak from your bones before the battle even began. Zulu regiments did the same with their choreographed maneuvers. Hundreds of men stamping shields in perfect rhythm, raising spears with one voice, creating a wall of sound and movement so precise it looked less like a gathering of fighters and more like an earthquake given form. Enemies didn't just see soldiers, they saw inevitability, a force already to synchronize to break. On the Great Plains, war dances before raids or after victories often spilled into display as well. Warriors paraded their painted bodies, their feathers, their weapons, their songs. The intention wasn't just to honor spirits, it was to broadcast strength. Every feather spoke of coup counted, every scar carried a story. Every step announced that the man moving before you had touched death and come back. This theatrical edge made the dance itself a weapon. Intimidation wasn't a byproduct, it was strategy. Terrify the enemy before the clash, and you weakened them without drawing blood. And terror was more effective when it looked supernatural. Painted faces, distorted voices, trembling limbs, it was as if spirits were visibly crawling under the skin. And yet, the theater wasn't only for enemies. Communities themselves were the audience, watching their sons and husbands transfigured into something unrecognizable. The performance reassured them. The warriors weren't ordinary anymore. They were touched, bound, armored by forces unseen. But the story of war dances didn't end on the battlefield. The same movements that terrified enemies also returned after the clash, reshaped into commemoration gestures and rhythms that honored the dead, bound the living, and secured the balance of memory. The steps didn't stop once the fighting ended. When weapons were set aside and the smoke cleared, the dance returned, this time not to prepare for death, but to speak with it. Victory or loss, the rhythm carried the community back into balance. Movements that had once summoned courage now honored the fallen, binding the living and the dead in the same circle. On the Great Plains, after a raid, men reenacted their deeds through dance. Each step, each gesture, told a story: how a coup was countered, how a comrade fell, how a horse was taken. The community didn't just hear the tale, they saw it, embodied in rhythm. It was memory turned into choreography, ensuring the deeds of warriors didn't evaporate into silence. In Polynesia, dances after battle were performed to thank the gods and ancestors for protection. They weren't private moments of gratitude, they were public spectacles, reminders that survival wasn't luck, but favor granted from beyond. Every stomp on the earth repaid the spirits, sealing the bond so it wouldn't fray before the next conflict. Zulu regiments, too, used post-battle dances to mark continuity. Victories were celebrated with fierce stamping and chants, but even in grief, the rhythm returned. The dead weren't left behind. They were drawn into the circle, remembered in movements that folded them into the lineage of warriors. This act of commemoration carried weight. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was survival. If warriors weren't honored properly, their spirits might linger, restless, angry. By dancing their names into memory, the community secured peace with the dead. The living could move forward only if the departed were carried forward with them. And so war dances weren't single-use rituals. They spanned the whole cycle. Before the fight, they summoned strength. During the fight, they embodied transformation. After the fight, they tied loose ends with the supernatural. Rhythm bridged preparation and remembrance. Turning war into something more than blood and tactics, it became continuity, a chain that bound generations. But continuity didn't mean stagnation. Even when the wars faded, the dances didn't disappear. They reshaped themselves, shedding some of their blood-soaked edges while keeping their core, the link between the human body and the unseen. Even after the weapons dulled and the battlefields emptied, the dancers refused to die. They slipped into new forms, surviving long after the wars that had birthed them. What once prepared men for blood became heritage, spectacle, and sometimes quiet defiance against erasure. The Maori haka is the most visible survivor, no longer just a prelude to spears and clubs. It's performed on rugby fields, at funerals, in political protests. The old intensity hasn't softened, it still summons ancestors, still folds performers into something larger than themselves. Its survival isn't nostalgia, it's continuity, a way of keeping the supernatural woven into the fabric of modern identity. On the plains, dances that once circled the fire before raids reshaped into powwow traditions. The war bonnet, the drum, the steady steps, these carry echoes of preparation and remembrance. They're not staged as rehearsals for combat anymore, but the rhythm still binds communities, still whispers the old logic. Movement is memory, and memory is survival. Zulu regiments transformed to their war dances, once preludes to the battlefield, now mark ceremonies, weddings, and public commemorations. The stamping shields and fierce chants are no longer directed at enemies, but at audiences, both local and foreign. Yet the supernatural thread remains. Even in performance, the movements recall a time when rhythm meant protection, when unity meant life or death. Anthropologists often describe this transformation as folklore, but that misses the point. These dances aren't relics, they're negotiations. In modern contexts, they remind both dancers and onlookers that the supernatural still hums beneath daily life, even if the battlefield has shifted to new terrain. And perhaps that's the most unsettling continuity. The war dance, stripped of spears and blood, still binds people to forces larger than themselves. The supernatural hasn't vanished, it's just found new stages. The movements may no longer prepare men to face death in the morning, but they still rehearse an old truth, that rhythm can turn fragile bodies into vessels for something eternal.